Katie,
Hi.
I love seeing you in that video with Dr. Blumenthal in her admiral's uniform.
It's so invigorating to be here with so many smart, badass women. And Susan Blumenthal, you blow me away every time. And you're amazing, really.
You can imagine what it was like going to the CIA with her and having her tell them they needed to use their technology on women's breasts. So,
Yeah.
Anyway, Katie, it's always wonderful to be with you, and it's especially wonderful to be with you here in person.
Thank you, Melanne.
So as you know so well, Katie has become one of the most public and vocal advocates for cancer awareness and for research in this country. We're very fortunate that she is doing what she's doing. And you saw in the video how she stepped into this role for very personal reasons. Her husband, Jay, died of colon cancer in 1998 at the age of 42. We were all in a state of shock. I will never forget. Her sister, Emily, who was an extraordinary politician, a really rising star in Virginia politics, died 3 years later of pancreatic cancer at the age of 54. And 3 years ago, Katie herself was diagnosed with early stage breast cancer. And she has faced each of these challenges by trying to educate the public, lucky us, and raise this critical research dollars, even to change health policy by virtue of what she does. And not only did she televise her own colonoscopy, can you imagine if you haven't
Good
seen
morning.
it? Which resulted in a 20% increase in colon cancer screening. So there is huge method to what she does in terms of advancing this issue. It's not just something she talks about. She walks the walk. And in 2008, she co-founded, what you just saw in the video, Stand Up to Cancer, which has raised more than $800 million to fund collaborative cancer research. So Katie, I just remember so well back in the late 90s when Jay died. And Katie came to the fore in the work that she continues to do to this day to talk to the public about this. And you even used the platform of the White House at the time to really put a focus on this critical issue. So the war on cancer was declared almost a half a century ago by then President Nixon. Where are we?
Gosh, in this room, I feel like there's so many qualified people to answer this question, but from a more of a layperson's perspective, Melanne, I think we have made a lot of progress. I was reading that in the mid-70s, the number of people, the percentage of people who lived 5 years or longer after a cancer diagnosis was 49%. Today, it's 68%. So we have made a lot of, incremental, I think, advancements through the years, and I think a lot has been done. For example, Stand Up to Cancer helps support an immunotherapeutic study, actually clinical trial at Sloan Kettering, and it was for people who had colorectal, mostly rectal cancer, and a small subset with a specific genetic mutation was given immunotherapy, and they had a complete response rate. So all of these people who might have died within years and potentially even months are now living today. So, things like that, clinical trials like that, give me a lot of hope. As many of the medical experts in this room know, we have much more targeted therapies, radioactive isotopes that are like heat-seeking missiles that go to the cancer cells and leave the healthy cells alone. For so long, chemotherapy, obviously, and it's still very an important therapy, but it sort of has this scorched body aspect to it where healthy cells are killed. So I think they're doing more targeted therapy, more personalized medicine, which is really exciting. And so obviously with screening, there's AI. I read about a doctor at MIT, and Susan, you might even know her, who was both a radiologist and a breast cancer patient. And she helped develop AI through sort of thousands of scans, which will not only identify tumors, but they have this ability to predict the environment that may produce tumors. So that will really give guidance to people in terms of screening and monitoring. So we're making tremendous progress, and we're really at an inflection point. That is why it sucks so badly that they're cutting funding for the NIH by 40%. It's unconscionable, in my opinion. They're going to stop a lot of this really promising science dead in its track. I don't know if you all read the New York Times Magazine piece on this, but it was absolutely devastating what is happening to clinical trials and incredibly promising research. I went to the rally for medical research in Washington last week and spoke, and I know that there are senators, there's a bipartisan group of senators that are fighting that. And right now, the situation is very dynamic, but I'm really hoping that they will reverse that and make sure that these cuts to the NIH don't happen. But we'll have to see, and we'll have to keep the pressure on, honestly, keep the pressure on Congress. You saw what the pressure did with Jimmy Kimmel and Disney, so why can't we do that for medical research?
Absolutely, and it does seem like there's a growing bipartisan concern on this now, so we can only hope that it gets reversed. Katie, you're such a strong advocate for early diagnosis and screening. Explain that.
Well, I think it's really simple. Early detection saves lives. The earlier you're able to detect cancer or get a diagnosis, the better your chances are of survival. And colon cancer is such a good example of this. You know, colons are these miraculous things. I mean, I love colons. How weird is that? And you've seen mine. But, you know, it's sort of like a package. And if you are able to extract a polyp or even a cancerous polyp before it penetrates the colon wall and results in systemic disease that can lead to metastases on other organs. Like when Jay was diagnosed, he had tumors all over his liver. He was stage 4 metastatic colon cancer. But if you can catch it before that happens, that really does literally mean the difference between life or death. And so we have to get more people to get screened. There are other methods in addition to colonoscopies, you know, Cologuard and FIT tests. And, you know, my feeling is the best test is the one that gets done. And they reduced the age, in I think, universally in like 2021 to 45. For Black and African Americans, it was 45 because the incidence is much higher. But now for all Americans, they should get screened starting at 45. But a third of people, all eligible adults, don't get screened. And when it comes to 45 to 49, only 20% of those people are getting screened, because I don't think the word has permeated society that the age has been lowered. So tell all your friends, if you know people who are 45, they really need to get screened for colorectal cancer. And obviously, all the other cancers that have screening, methods available to them, like breast cancer, clearly. And we need more screening for other cancers as well.
You know, we're reading a lot today about how younger and younger people are being afflicted with cancer diagnoses in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, as you mentioned. Do we know why this is happening? Do we have any idea?
No, but it is so heartbreaking. You know, I get a lot of people calling me when someone is diagnosed, especially with colon cancer, but also with breast cancer, and wanting advice or referrals. And, you know, I recently talked to a mom who happens to be a doctor. Her 26-year-old son was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. And you're right, people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, younger than the screening age. And scientists and epidemiologists are really trying to figure this out. It's a very vexing problem. And by the way, a lot of really healthy people are being diagnosed with cancer. And by the way, it's not just colon cancer. I think 17 cancers are increasing dramatically. I know that non-smoking women under 50 are being diagnosed in really worrisome numbers with lung cancer. But anyway, it's a real problem. So they're looking at all these theories, right? And now we're trying to understand the microbiome much better, but they're looking at the overprescription of antibiotics, potentially microplastics that are everywhere. You know, they're starting to find them in our brains and in fetuses. It's really scary how ubiquitous these microplastics are. So they're looking at that to see if that has somehow disrupted the microbiome. They're looking at screens. Honestly, if somehow screen time is influencing or having an impact on people's health and overall kind of biology. Obviously, some things like ultra-processed food and obesity and alcohol, but these numbers are so scary. I read that in the next 5 years, the number of people diagnosed with colorectal cancer under 50 is going to almost double. So we really need to figure out why this is happening so we can give better public health advice and stop these really, young people from this devastating disease. There was a study in Northern Virginia, by the way. My sister Emily's son, Ray, is now a gastrointestinal oncologist in Northern Virginia. And one of his colleagues did a study of all these marathon runners and ultramarathon runners. I don't know if any of you all read this in the Times, but they had an inordinate number of polyps. Is it sort of ultra-processed protein supplements or protein bars people are eating? They don't really know, but there are so many people who are on the case, Melanne, who are really focused on early onset disease that I hope we come up with some answers really quickly because, as I said, it's just absolutely devastating.
I read that story about the marathoners, young people, men and women, who, as you just said, Katie, are getting this diagnosis. And one woman said, I'm not going to give up being a marathoner, but I am going to get my screening regularly.
Yeah.
It's just puts in perspective how terrible these funding cuts are because we really do need support for cancer research. We've been talking a lot about technology. Is AI a game changer?
I think it is. Well, as I mentioned, and nobody knows this better than Susan Blumenthal, I mean, I think it's so exciting that we are going to be able, the AI will be able to read these scans better than a radiologist. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, the idea that it not only identifies a problem, but can be predictive, I think is a real game changer. So I think when it comes to diagnoses, that's really exciting. Of course, the other thing is these liquid biopsies or blood tests that are really not quite ready for prime time, as far as I know. I have to talk to some of the doctors who are more knowledgeable about liquid biopsies. But there are a lot of people developing them that will be able to determine if you have cancer at this very cellular, very early stage. I think they're not quite ready yet. But can you imagine what a game changer that will be, particularly, for young people? If you can go get a physical and get a blood test and they can look at sort of to determine if you have the beginnings of a whole panoply of cancers, how great that will be. So I am really optimistic about these new diagnostic modalities that people are working on.
You mentioned how important screening and early detection is. Can you tell us a little bit about your own experience with breast cancer and how that played out in terms of the outcome?
Yeah, I was pretty stunned when 3 years ago my breast radiologist said, I don't really like what I see here. I'm like, seriously? And so I had a biopsy, and she called me, and she said, you have breast cancer. I couldn't believe it. I think a lot of us are lulled into this sense of complacency or sense of security because we don't have a family history, and there was no family history for me of breast cancer. And so it was really pretty shocking. But because I know a fair amount about cancer at this point, having dealt with the loss of my husband and my sister and really all the work that I've done in the years since, I knew that because I was diagnosed with stage 1B, that I had a very good chance of being treated and being cured. And so I was really lucky. I had a lumpectomy and radiation, and I kept thinking the whole time, gosh, I am so lucky. What do women do who don't have access to this kind of health care, who can't afford to pay these specialists, who, whose insurance doesn't really cover, or who have no insurance? That's all I kept thinking about, Melanne, during my treatment. And I said to my breast surgeon, Lisa Newman, who I stan Lisa Newman, New York Hospital. If anybody needs a good breast cancer surgeon, I highly recommend her. I would say to her all the time, what do women do? It's just so unfair that we have such a caste system when it comes to healthcare in America. It infuriates me. But I felt, conversely, unbelievably fortunate that I had access and I got, the treatment, and I feel fine. I need to take my aromatase inhibitors much more regularly. Don't yell at me, Dr. Blumenthal. Anyway, so speaking of dense breasts, not that you have them, but I have them. So Susan said 60%. I'd always understood 40%. Whatever the statistic is, my understanding, 42% of women over 40 have dense breasts. There are 4 different breast densities. I feel embarrassed because Susan is here and she knows all this stuff. But anyway, my point is, I always get mammograms and breast sonograms because my radiologist said, when you have dense breasts and you're looking at a mammogram, it's like looking for a snowball in a backdrop of snow. It's really sometimes very hard to see it, and that's why I always get breast sonograms. Well, I found out that most women, don't even know they have dense breasts. Finally, the FDA, a couple of years ago, I think it was in 2024, last year, mandated that clinicians notify patients and tell them they have dense breast tissue. But still, a lot of women don't know what that means or what to do about it. And what it means is you probably need additional screening in the form of MRIs or breast sonograms. So I got together with some Rosa DeLauro. I always want to call her Laura DeRosa. Rosa DeLauro on Capitol Hill from Connecticut. And we decided that we're trying to introduce legislation called the Find It Early Act, which will mandate insurance companies cover additional screening for all the women in the country that have dense breasts. Because again, it's just not fair that I can afford a breast sonogram and so many other women can't. And not to mention the women who don't even have access to mammograms. So hopefully, even educating women about dense breasts has been kind of something I've really tried to do since my diagnosis, because there's something flying around the stage, but I don't know what it is. Like when something happens to me personally, I turn it into an opportunity professionally, because I feel like I have a platform. I feel like I've been doing this so many years. And I think through trying to understand Jay's cancer, are you telling us to wrap? Sorry. Trying to understand Jay's cancer and my sister Emily, and then my husband John had a carcinoid tumor the size of a coconut 3 months before we got married. I'm like, what am I, the black fucking widow? Luckily, he did well. He got a liver resection. I love livers almost as much as colons, by the way, because they grow back. They're amazing organs. But anyway, I digress. What was I saying?
Well,
can you tell how much I love having an audience again?
I'm sure they'd come back over and over, too, to hear you. But they're telling us to wrap up, but I'm not going to listen to them because I promised you I would ask the question about this new documentary that you're working on.
Thank you, because I can't think of a better room to talk to about this. So Dawn Porter, who is a really talented documentary filmmaker, lawyer turned documentary documentarian. She's done like the documentary on Luther Vandross and John Lewis and Lady Bird Johnson's Diaries and Eye on the Prize. Anyway, we have teamed up, and we are actually, and Susan, I need to call you about this. We're doing a documentary about the disparities in medical research between men and women. I was shocked I was shocked. I've worked on this for 3 years because I have kind of a spidey sense about like what issues are really coming to the fore. And I just think it's really important. When I realized women weren't included in clinical trials till 1993, and this is my favorite statistic, erectile dysfunction thank you, I just like saying that too. Erectile dysfunction that affects 19% of men gets five times the amount of funding as PMS, which affects 90% of women. How screwed up is that?
Very screwed up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm happy for them, but come on.
Well, we are going to have to close this
On that note.
fascinating discussion. And it is truly, but Katie, before you leave this stage, from all of us, thank you from the bottom of my heart and their hearts for what you do all the
Melanne.
time.
Thank you.